Folks, I've got some bad news for you. You might not like the news that I bring, but it's something you need. Just for a second, pretend I'm your doctor. I'm brown and I wear glasses, so it shouldn't be too hard. This is gonna be a tough sell, because I basically have to convince you that even though you pay crazy amounts of rent for a closet and share your bathroom with four random, extremely hairy men, that what you really need in life is more people in your country. In a nutshell, if we don't move towards a big Australia, we are royally screwed. Why? Let's find out. Before looking at Australian population demographics, let's take a peek at the population demographics of the planet to put things into perspective. Here's what I think is your outlook of the world population. The world is rapidly becoming overpopulated. We live on a planet with finite resources. This is causing huge strains on the environment, with climate change being one of the indicators. And this is not sustainable in the long run. Here's another thing. You're wrong. Not only is the world not headed towards overpopulation, but there is a strong possibility that we're moving towards a global population collapse.
Contrary to, most people think we have too many people on the planet, but actually this is an outdated view. This is assuming that AI is fine, assuming that there's a benevolent future with AI. I think that the biggest problem the world will face in 20 years is population collapse. Collapse.
I agree.
I want to emphasize this. The biggest issue in 20 years will be population collapse.
And no, Elon isn't stoned again. He is saying this for a reason. Our planet is not a static place. Trends that might seem obvious can actually be very misleading. I showed you this population growth graph before, but this is the population growth rate projection for the next 80 years. Since the agricultural revolution increased our capacity to accumulate food and capital, our ability to sustain large populations grew as well. The fields that were growing these cash crops needed large families to work on them. And this meant a farmer needed to have the same sex drive as Goofy. This, coupled with healthcare advancements over the centuries, reduced infant mortality rates and increased life expectancy. The Industrial Revolution began to change this with the advent of urbanization. Urban cities of Europe in a post-industrial revolution era didn't really need big families, and hence the birth rates peaked with the post-war boomer generation. In contrast to previous analysis, it actually turns out that women throughout history, irrespective of being educated or uneducated, exercise their reproductive rights based on their circumstances and needs. And when those circumstances and needs change, they too adapt. Rest of the world is quickly catching up with Europe. These last 2 decades have been revolutionary. The world is rapidly moving towards the cities and abandoning the countryside. And this means there isn't a need to have large families. In fact, all the incentives are not to have a big family. Urban population size in the 50s looked like this. This is what it looks like today. If you ask your parents' generation, they were petrified of the population boom of East Asia. Populations of China, Japan, Korea were feared to become so large that they would take over the entire world. This is less than 3 decades ago. The same East Asian countries today are sweating over falling birth rates and contracting economies. The entire world, aside from Africa, is experiencing birth rate decline. Early indicators are suggesting that even Africa is headed in the same direction. I think the next question that you may have is, why is a big population even important? Surely having less people fighting over the same resources is a better thing. Again, it's not as simple as it may seem. We live in a world where we have subscribed to a beastly system called capitalism. Capitalism has several inherent requirements for its survival. One of them is, any investment made in this system needs a profit on it, otherwise it fails to reproduce itself and dies. This leads to a constant hunger of growth. Without growth, the system itself capitulates. It manages this growth by a system of supply and demand. For there to be a high supply for revenue generation, there needs to be an ever-growing demand. Where does this demand come from? People. All those people you despise are critical for your food and livelihood security in this system. Less people means less demand. Now, before you start bagging out capitalism and advocate for its replacement, just know this is coming from a Marxist. We tried and failed. 20th century communism was an epic disaster. Yeah, but what does it mean for us? We have a relatively low population, meaning low aggregate domestic demand, and we have structured our economy to adapt to this reality. Well, if we don't have enough people buying our stuff, let's just get people overseas to buy it. We've been blessed with natural resources like coal and iron ore that are valuable for populous overseas markets looking to fuel and grow their countries. If this overseas demand collapses, there aren't enough people in Australia to buy and use our commodities. Even our agricultural produce dramatically surpasses local demand. For the Australian economy to do well, rest of the world needs to be doing well too.
So immigration is one of the key reasons that Australians are used to talking about economic growth rates of 3% or 4%. Part of that's underpinned by much faster population growth. Australia is suffering at the moment from pretty weak wage growth. That's worrying a lot of people. There's a lot of fear right now that China is hitting a wall. That'll hit demand for Australian products. Australia to do really well, the rest of the world has to do well.
Primarily relying on international consumers is a vulnerable position to be in, irrespective of whether this foreign market is China or not. With the world headed towards population decline, our long-term future is uncertain. On top of that, there's the issue of the domestic population time bomb. Boomers that are in record numbers are starting to retire, depending on pensions and other social benefits like the generation before them. But this time, the population size covering them is much smaller. Less taxes are being collected and more is being spent than what was needed before. Australian politicians have tried to address these concerns by attracting foreign migrants. Australian population growth, in comparison to our European cousins, has been somewhat stable because of this strategy. But our politicians have failed to recognize a structural flaw. Rapid pace of urbanization trend that I've mentioned before applies to us as well. Migrants that we attract end up moving to city centres like Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. This is in addition to young Australians living in regional and rural Australia moving to the same cities. Although our countryside is actually hemorrhaging people, the illusion this creates is that Australia is getting too crowded. After all, most of us live in these cities and are now facing things like higher rents, crowding, and unbearable traffic congestions. Our politicians, to deal with this growing public frustration, but at the same time realizing how important migration is for the economy, ended up making the situation worse by filtering out migrants to highly skilled people with technological knowledge. Look, in theory, this is a good thing. But imagine if you're a migrant from India with a PhD in IT. Where are you moving to in Australia? My guess is not fucking double. Politicians have consistently failed to account the accelerating urbanization in their migration policy, and as a result have failed to keep up with the infrastructure required. This is why you're sharing your bathroom with 4 other men, and not because Australia is overpopulated. So how can we address these issues? Look, we have to move away from this mineral and commodity export economy. Every economic indicator seems to suggest that there is going to be a crippling dead end down this road. Whether it be future global demographic demand issues or a move towards carbon neutral energy production of the world, it is likely that a fair bit of our natural treasure will be much less valuable than it is today. We need to start making more kinds of things and bring back high-end manufacturing that we have outsourced to other countries. We need to do this by building domestic demand through a larger consumer base of people. But instead of just handing out passports, we need a strategy to ensure disbursement of populations, as opposed to stacking people on top of each other into 2 or 3 major cities, which we unfortunately have been doing. We could look into establishing 21st century special economic zones in regional Australia based on the Chinese model, with incentives that are far too great for Australian and international corporations to ignore. Essentially, we need to make our regional towns big urban cities. In addition to incentivizing migration, we could look into developing a policy framework to increase birth rates within Australia, but slightly more comprehensive than Peter Costello's baby bonus scheme. We need to start investing heavily in desalination of water to ensure that we can meet the requirements for a growing population. Rainfall patterns due to climate change are likely to change, and depending on rain alone is suicidal even for the existing population, let alone a growing one. Or we could not do any of this. Preserve our cultural identity, conserve what we have. That's a choice I respect. My entire argument is that's a choice we may end up regretting.